Clarendon Palace is a medieval ruin 2¼ miles east of Salisbury in Wiltshire, England. The palace was a royal residence during the Middle Ages, and was the location of the Assize of Clarendon, which developed the Constitutions of Clarendon. The name Clarendon is the Old English word for clover-covered hill. Roman era. There is evidence that the Romans used Clarendon Forest on a regular basis. A Roman road connecting to Old Saramayan Age Hill Fort passes east-west approximately 2 miles north of Clarendon Forest. Archaeological finds suggest that the area was relatively densely populated in the Roman period. Hunting lodge. Clarendon Forest was probably in use as a royal hunting ground in the late Saxon period. It is also documented that the area was sometimes used as a military gathering place from 1070 onwards. The Norman kings also visited it, and the park was probably formally defined with deer leaps in the early 12th century by Henry I. Within its boundaries, the park was laid out with laws, coppices, meadows and wood pasture. By 1130 a hunting lodge existed within the park, residence and palace. Both Henry II and Henry III invested heavily in the property and converted it into a royal residence and palace. Considerable building work took place in the early to mid-13th century, including the construction of King's Chapel and the Antioch Chamber under the supervision of Elias of Dereham, the ecclesiastical administrator who also oversaw the building of Salisbury Cathedral. In 1164, Henry II framed the Constitutions of Clarendon here, which attempted to restrict ecclesiastical privileges and place limits on papal authority in England. A memorial erected on the site in 1844 stated, "The spirit awakened within these walls ceased not until it had vindicated the authority of the laws and accomplished the reformation of the Church of England." At its height, the palace consisted of several buildings surrounding a central courtyard and contained inside a small wall. The palace was rectangular with dimensions of roughly 240 meters by 80 meters, totaling over 5 acres, and included terraced gardens. Margaret Howell writes, "The site of the royal palace at Clarendon has been the subject of a recent detailed archaeological investigation, which helps to create a lively impression of accommodation there in the early 1250s, shortly after a major program of enlargement and refurbishment. Many of the details come from the Chancery rolls. By 1252 Eleanor had a compact suite of apartments at Clarendon, comprising a hall, a chapel, 3 chambers and a wardrobe. They were situated on 2 floors. The rooms were spacious, 2 of them extending to a length of 40 feet, and the amenities of her chambers had been greatly improved by the adjacent construction of a 2-story building providing access to a fair privy chamber, well vaulted on both floors. The focal point of the Queen's Hall was an imposing new fireplace with double marble columns on each side and an overmantel carved with representations of the 12 months of the year. The windows of her rooms were glazed, perhaps mainly in plain glass of the delicate silver-grey grisaille patines, but also with some figured glass, which would be colored. The windows of her hall overlooked a garden. The chapel, on the upper floor, had a marble altar, flanked by 2 windows which could be opened and closed, and above the altar was a crucifix, with the figures of Mary and John. Religious imagery was not confined to the chapel. In the window of one of the Queen's chambers there was a representation of the Virgin and Child, with the kneeling figure of an earthly queen, presumably Queen Eleanor herself, with an Ave Maria scroll. The walls of the chapel were initially painted with scenes from the life of Saint Catherine, but later redecorated with symbols and stories as arranged. One distinctively up-to-date feature of these rooms were the tiled floors, and the remaining portion of one of these, lifted in the post-war excavations at Clarendon, can be seen on the far wall in the medieval ceramics room of the British Museum. The pavement dates from 1252 and was laid in one of Eleanor's ground floor chambers, divided into panels of patterned and figured tiles, glowing in muted shades of gold, grey, and warm pink. Its power to evoke is incomparable. It was in 1453 at Clarendon Palace that King Henry VI first started to show signs of insanity. Usage of the palace declined, and by 1500 the building was no longer being maintained, and in 1574 it was described as a simple hunting lodge. In that year, Elizabeth I visited the site, but the buildings were in such poor condition that she had to dine in a temporary banquet house. Confiscation and Decay. In 1649 the execution of Charles I resulted in the confiscation of Clarendon Palace by Parliament. Following the restoration of Charles II in 1660, the park passed briefly into the hands of George Monk, and then in 1664 to Edward Hyde, who had already, in 1661, taken the title Earl of Clarendon. A new mansion, Clarendon Park, was built in a classical design elsewhere in the park in the early 18th century. Abandoned Clarendon Palace deteriorated, and by the 18th century the ruins survived only as a romantic eye-catcher in the landscape, and as simple farm buildings. Nicolaus Pevsner wrote in 1963, "Today Clarendon is a tragedy. A footpath leads into the wood. One threads one's way through elder and wild clematis. A solitary old iron notice board of the Ministry of Works indicates that one has arrived. One crag of walling stands up. All the rest is back to its sleeping beauty." A series of campaigns of archaeological excavation were undertaken at the site between 1933 and 1939 by the Finnish art historian Tancred Borenius. Further excavations were carried out in 1957, 1964, 1965 and in the 1970s and 1980s. A tile kiln discovered on the site has been reconstructed and is now at the British Museum. All that is visible now above ground level is the one end wall of the Great Hall. The site is a scheduled monument. Bibliography. Borenius, J. Charlton, J. Clarendon Palace, an interim report. Antiquaries Journal, 1655-84. DO 10.1017 per seconds 003581500011380. Colvin, H. M. Brown, R. Allen, Taylor, A. J. The History of the King's Works. 2. London, HMSO, pp. 910-918. Howell, Margaret. Eleanor of Provence, Queenship in 13th Century England. Oxford, Blackwell. ISBN 0-631-22739-3. Eames, E.S. A 13th-century tiled pavement from the King's Chapel, Clarendon Palace. Journal of the British Archaeological Association. 3rd Sir, 26-40-50. Eames, Elizabeth. The Royal Apartments at Clarendon Palace in the Reign of Henry III. Journal of the British Archaeological Association. 3rd Sir, 28-57-85. Eames, E.S. Further notes on a 13th-century tiled pavement from the King's Chapel, Clarendon Palace. Journal of the British Archaeological Association. 3rd Sir, 35-71-5. James Tom Beaumont Robinson, A. M. Clarendon Palace. The History and Archaeology of a Medieval Palace and Hunting Lodge near Salisbury, Wiltshire. Society of Antiquaries and Amp. Thames and Hudson. James. Tom Beaumont. Gerard. Christopher. Clarendon. Landscape of Kings. Bollington. Windgather Press. ISBN 9781905119103. Pevsner. Nicolaus. Cherry. Bridget. Wiltshire. Buildings of England. Harmondsworth. Penguin. pp. 180–81. Richardson, Amanda. The Medieval Forest, Park and Palace of Clarendon, Wiltshire c. 1200 c. 1650. Reconstructing an actual, conceptual and documented Wiltshire landscape. British Archaeological Reports British Series. 387. Oxford. Archaeopress. ISBN 1841718254.